Welcome back, everyone. Thank you for rejoining the meeting. We are going to start with bringing in one of our speakers who we did not get to include during the public comments and discussion. This is Brian Callaghan from the American Academy of Neurology. So we're just gonna thank you for rejoining and being able to provide us with your comments. Go ahead.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. My name is Dr. Brian Callaghan, and I'm making comments today on behalf of the American Academy of Neurology. The American Academy of Neurology is the world's largest neurology specialty society, representing more than 36,000 neurologists and clinical neuroscience professionals. Its members have specialized training in diagnosing, treating, and managing disorders of the brain and nervous system, including mild cognitive impairment and Alzheimer's disease. AAN members are dedicated to promoting the highest quality patient-centered neurologic care by providing safe and effective treatments, but are unsure if aducanumab is the best option for their patients based on the current data. The AAN has been monitoring aducanumab's approval process and is concerned about the implications relating to several considerations highlighted in ICER's report, including drug efficacy and costs to the healthcare system and patients. The AAN appreciates many of the considerations included in the ICER report related to the ENGAGE and EMERGE clinical trials. The highly irregular clinical trial process leaves a plethora of questions about the efficacy patients and providers can expect from aducanumab as it begins to see widespread use. Many AAN members now face pressure for appropriate prescribing, given the uncertainties surrounding efficacy. The AAN also echoes ICER's concerns regarding the lack of racial and ethnic diversity in the clinical trial population, given the disproportionate impact of Alzheimer's disease on Black and Hispanic individuals. Given the current data, future clinical trials are needed to firmly establish or refute efficacy of aducanumab and to see if results are generalizable to other populations. The AAN was heartened to see the FDA update the label to patients with mild cognitive impairment or mild dementia, as this is in line with the recommendations we sent to the FDA prior to aducanumab's approval. However, as noted in ICER's revised evidence report, Biogen has set an annual price for aducanumab at $56,000. Unfortunately, patients are likely to bear a significant amount of financial hardship given the rising out-of-pocket costs of many neurologic medicines that has occurred over the last several years. Furthermore, the impact on Medicare Part B spending cannot be overstated, as aducanumab could cost more than $1 trillion before its clinical benefit is adequately demonstrated, depending on how many patients take the drug. The AAN agrees with ICER that due to the high systemic and out-of-pocket costs, aducanumab could only be administered to a very small number of patients before the need for federal policy changes to address access and affordability. The budget impact on the healthcare system and individual patients is very concerning, including factors not included in the ICER analysis, such as ancillary costs associated with infusions and testing. The AAN is grateful to ICER for conducting this thorough review of a drug that will have such an impact on neurologic patients and our health system broadly. We hope this report continues to inform stakeholder discussions on critical questions for aducanumab, including the required phase 4 clinical trial and insurance coverage. And with that, thank you so much.
Thank you very much indeed. Does anyone on the CTAF panel have a question for Dr. Callaghan or a comment? Okay, thank you again very much. I'm glad we were able to get the audio squared away.
Thanks so much.
Looks like you're taking care of patients today, so I hope it's a good day. All right. Okay, so now we officially shift gears to the further deliberation and the voting questions. I just want to make sure all the CTAF panel are, yep, they've been back for a while and I can see you. What I'm going to do is just we'll show the first voting question, and then again, we're going to take a step back and reflect on the evidence, reflect on the comments that have been made. And so why don't we go ahead and advance to the first question. If folks can advance the slide, please. There we go. So we only have one drug, obviously under consideration today. And the first question is the core one on clinical effectiveness. The wording is the available evidence adequate to demonstrate that the net health benefit of aducanumab plus supportive care is superior to that provided by supportive care alone? Let me first invite Grace Lynn to give a very brief, again, summary of the key findings in the evidence review and summarize the ICER evidence rating. Grace?
Thank you, Steve. Let me remind you that we found that aducanumab was effective in reducing beta amyloid on PET scans. However, the two clinical trials, Emerge and Engage, showed disparate results, with one of the trials, Engage, showing no clinically significant difference on CDR-SB, and the other, Emerge, showing a small statistically significant difference on CDR-SB when looking at the intention to treat population in the high dose 10 milligram per kilogram group. In your evidence summary, you'll also note some additional figures that show the effect in the post-protocol 4 population. This is the population for which the drug, the high dose group in the ApoE positive was titrated up to 10 milligrams. And again, that shows a small effect in the high dose group. Finally, I'll just draw your attention to the fact that the harms of the drug in terms of ARIA-E and ARIA-H, and the fact that approximately 40% of patients in the treatment group experienced ARIA. And then in terms of our evidence rating, we rated the evidence insufficient to assess whether aducanumab provided net health benefit over supportive care only, due to the low certainty of benefit and the certainty that some harm will be experienced by patients.
Okay. Again, I also want to thank Matthew and Laura for their public comments, and they're again with us as we have this conversation, along with our clinical experts. We haven't engaged you guys very much so far. We certainly opened up the floor if you guys had comments or questions. But let me just invite you now, before I even take questions or comments from the CTAF panel. You certainly, this is not the first day or month that you've been thinking about these data. You've been involved in some of the trials yourselves. How would you give your perspective on the data to the CTAF panel as they weigh it again before they vote? Dr. Henderson, may I ask you to start?
Yeah, thank you. It's really hard to disengage the two trials, Engage and Emerge. I think it's hard to take one without considering the other. And so in that sense, trying to explain why one trial, the findings in one trial differ from the other, I think is not really the most important question to be asking. I also think that even in the Emerge trial, the magnitude of the effect was very small. I'm thinking on average, it is too small to be clinically meaningful. It's too small to be noticed by family members, by patients. And it concerns me that we want to have a treatment that is statistically effective, but really may not make the kind of difference that we really want, we really need in patient lives. And I'll make one other comment, and this is more of a question, but I think I saw in some of the FDA slides that there really wasn't an important correlation between the amount of amyloid removed from the brain during the course of these two trials and the change in the primary outcome, which was the CDR sum of boxes. And if it's really the underlying biology that's driving the effect, why was there not this kind of correlation that one would expect to see? What is that really telling us about what's going on?
All right, and I'll circle back certainly if others have questions on some of those points. Dr. Kremen, did you want to jump in and say anything? Oh, hopefully we will. I know her laptop is open. Hopefully we'll get her back in time. So, Dr. Henderson, I wanted to follow up on that, and I'll invite the ICER research team to reply, because I know that they were working with Biogen. And again, I think a lot of praise should go to the company for engaging with us throughout the review and for coming and participating meaningfully in the public meeting. And I know that this was an area in which the team had tried to work with Biogen to understand better. And you saw those slides that, in a sense, kind of showed anonymized findings and then revealed which were the high dose and low dose groups, to show that there was no consistency across the trials and trying to track a way to link the dosing with the outcome. But team, Grace, perhaps, can you let us know where you got with trying to investigate the relationship that Dr. Henderson mentioned, which was the per patient relationship between their amyloid level and their cognitive outcomes?
Yes, so that was presented by the FDA statistician, and he did a correlation analysis where the scatter plot that did basically show no relationship between amyloid removal and CDR-SB outcome. What we understand, and perhaps someone else with more expertise in this area can comment, but that there are some issues with the FDA statistician's analysis in terms of whether or not how you examine the longitudinal relationship between amyloid pathology and CDR-SB. I have heard some clinical experts say that, in fact, the FDA statistician did that incorrectly, and that is also what we heard from Biogen. And so that's something actually that we were unable to get confirmation one way or the other, whether or not the appropriate analyses were being done either by the FDA statistician, because we were unable to speak with him and get his point of view versus the Biogen explanation.
Thanks. Dr. Kremen, thanks. I'm glad you're back. Did you have, I don't know if you heard my question earlier, it was just as Grace had summarized their view of the evidence and the evidence rating. Did you have any perspective that you wanted to share before the panel starts to ask questions and comments?
I would just say that, the data is very complicated, and I appreciate the time and all of the different analyses that were done, to the best of my knowledge of trying to understand it all, because it is so complex. I think that's really my major point, is it's very complex.
Okay. All right. So at CTAF panel, do you guys have questions of clinical experts, patient experts, or the ICER team, or just your own view on the evidence that you'd like to start to say?
Yeah, I think this may be a question for our clinical experts or Grace or Dr. Lin, but I keep coming back to when I kind of looked at to see if in the most positive frame, the positive clinical, the statistically significant clinical improvement seen in the one study, I feel like is it Emerge or Engage?
It's Emerge.
My reading of I'm not familiar with the CDR scale, and I certainly don't ever use it clinically. And so my best reading is that it doesn't get anywhere close to what are commonly accepted thresholds for minimally meaningful clinical benefit. And when I looked at the research literature before this, it was kind of, you needed a benefit of at least kind of 1 to 3 or 1 to 2, somewhere in that range. And the benefits seen in the positive trial is like 1/3 of that or 1/4 of that. So it feels like it's, even though potentially statistically significant, that this is not necessarily clinically significant. And I was wondering, I wanted to get experts who are used to kind of evaluating this scale, because it is not something that I use clinically, if my reading is incorrect or correct.
Well, I think that's right. It surprised me a little bit that in the clinical trial, they defined a primary endpoint, which was the CDR sum of boxes. And I think for this kind of study, that is not the only acceptable endpoint, but certainly a very reasonable one. And so I have no concerns about that. But usually in clinical trials, one also wants to specify clinically meaningful difference. And I don't think that was done in this case. And as many of you may know, that with a very large sample size, you can find clinical significance on just about anything. And so having a clinically meaningful difference is really an important consideration. And I think 0.39, 0.4 points on an 18-point scale like the CDR axis is really not enough to be noticed by patients, by family members. And so I think it's too small. The sort of supporting evidence is if you look at one of the secondary arms, which was the mini mental state examination, in the eMERGE trial, I think the average difference was it was less than a point, I think a half a point, and someone can correct me on what the exact number is. So also, very small and a brief scale, but one that we're more familiar with. And so again, the average difference isn't really enough to make a difference. And that's what's really so frustrating, that we need something that does more. And I don't think that this is it.
Okay. Bob, you have a question or a comment. Go ahead.
Let me just go straight. Grace left a comment in the chat earlier that like struck a chord with me because I had noticed it before looking at the graphs. And we haven't mentioned rapid progressors. She did mention that. The one that really caught my eye earlier that she also mentioned was, and I know clinical trials extremely well. I know we can't pull one apart and put it into the other one. However, in this case, these two trials are supposed to be virtually identical, if not identical from original protocol, and the placebo groups do not match up. If we switch them, we're going to get different results for both of them. And just for grins, Grace, did you happen to actually try that and see what the numbers came out as?
That's a good question. No, we didn't try that, but that was one of our concerns, is that there was rapid worsening or greater worsening in the placebo group, and perhaps that actually accounted for the difference in CDR-SB in eMERGE compared with ENGAGE.
Okay, good question. Jeff.
Thank you. I wanted to ask Dr. Lin, if you struggled at all in your classification choice, did you struggle at all between I, which is insufficient, which means certainty in the evidence is low, and I believe that was the option you went with, versus choosing like a P/I, which is promising but inconclusive, which means moderate certainty of a small net benefit, small likelihood, perhaps, of a negative net benefit?
That's a great question, because that's exactly the struggle we had, going back and forth between the insufficient and the promising but inconclusive. And what it really came down to was two factors. One is that we really had questions about the validity of post hoc analyses. And so if you take, the ITT analyses and the fact that the trials were identical, it's just as likely that ENGAGE was true as eMERGE. We can't discount that possibility. So that was what brought us the low certainty part of the rating. And then the harm part of it really affected our thinking that, even if there is very small clinical benefit, there's also harm, and some of it, as we said, many of the cases of ARIA are asymptomatic, but some aren't. And 40% of people actually suffered ARIA, which is a pretty large proportion of the population. So we felt like, if there's no benefit at all, then basically you're exposing people to a drug with no benefit, but certainty of harm. If there's a small amount of benefit, you still have that certainty of harm. So that's why we ended up on I rather than PI.
Thank you very much, Steve. Is it possible for me to ask a follow-up question?
Sure.
I wondered if Dr. Henderson or Dr. Kremen had anything to add along what we've just been discussing as we think about how we vote. Specifically about what Dr. Lin just said. Are you kind of more or less in agreement, or do you see it differently?
I think I'll jump in then. I do see it similarly. I think, if there were treatments such as this that had, clear benefit, then I think the potential harms would be manageable. But given the very small level of potential benefit, given the known harms, I think it's a different balance. And I agree with Dr. Lin's statement.
I would also echo that. There may be some small number of people who will benefit. It's hard to know from the study who that would be, and without more information, and I don't even know if we have that data. And therefore, given the data such as it is, and given the risks from the standpoint of do no harm, it makes one feel uneasy. And so I agree, it's sort of where we come to as a resting point.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. I've got Jeff and Annette, and then I want to actually let Matthew have a comment. I have a question for Matt. I hope you don't mind my asking you a question in a few minutes. Jeff, go ahead.
Thanks. For Dr. Henderson and Kremen. Much has been made. We heard from the patient advocacy groups and from the manufacturer about the notion about this expedited approval and how we should have this available to neurology drugs just like we do to oncology drugs. And I'm curious as to what you think. What's the correlation? Is that a justifiable kind of thought, or what do we make out of that? Because this was approved. We're talking a lot about efficacy, but my understanding is it was largely approved on its efficacy on removing amyloid rather than on the actual clinical benefits. I'm curious as to what you think, whether that's a reasonable approach.
I'll allow it. It's a quasi policy roundtable question, Jeff, as you know, but I'll allow it for the moment. It sounds like it's a question of the clinical experts. It's a tough question. It's both about the amyloid hypothesis and about accelerated approval and about oncology. So put all that in the blender and see what you come up with.
I'll let Dr. Kremen first.
Yeah, I mean, it was approved based on the change in a biomarker, which is not clinical efficacy in this case, or it's a surrogate. And I think the issue is that although we know that having amyloid in your brain is not necessarily a good biomarker, it also doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to develop Alzheimer's disease later on down the road, at least when you have normal cognition. Obviously, this is being tested in people who have mild cognitive impairment and mild dementia. And so I really do understand, truly understand the position from where patients and families are coming from, because I see patients every day. I was a PI in this study, and I really know the dedication of the people that were in this study and in every study. And that's what makes this very, very hard, actually, is that though I know it can pull amyloid out of the brain, and I don't think anyone would dispute that, that's been proven. I mean, absolutely, this can pull amyloid out of the brain, which is really, really an exciting finding. It's just that we don't have the best data that this leads to something clinically significant in terms of everyday cognition and function. That's what it comes down to, I think.
And if I might add also, and I certainly agree with that, for Alzheimer's disease, perhaps more than any other illness I can think of, there is an unmet need. And I can see why the FDA, I can see why others are interested in the accelerated approval process that recognizes that an unmet need is an important part of the consideration. I think where the analogy with oncology drugs fall apart, though, is that using the biomarker as an outcome really is sort of a step until there are efficacy measures available. And here it's different. We had two large, well-conducted phase 3 clinical trials. I think they were well designed and seemingly well implemented, and we do have efficacy data. And the efficacy data are at best very modest. And I think in aggregate, there is no evidence for really clinical efficacy here. And so having a biomarker as the endpoint rather than taking advantage of the efficacy data we have here, I'm just not sure why the decision was made the way that it was.
Okay, thanks. Annette, go ahead.
Yeah, so I make two comments. One is, I have a lot of concerns that, we're talking about an 18-month trial, but because of the futility analysis was cut short and most of the patients only completed 12 months. Even in the positive trial emerge, the non-clinically significant difference, yet statistically significant difference in the primary outcome wasn't seen until 18 months. So we're talking about a subgroup of a subgroup of a subgroup. And that makes me really nervous given what we've seen in all of the other beta amyloid trials along with the ENGAGE trial. So I find that very troubling. That even when we talk about something being positive, it's not entirely clear to me what happened there. And then the second comment I will make, I heard Biogen creating, sort of creating this narrative that this is going to be like MS, and that's my area of specialty. And there are some extremely important distinctions. So in the initial MS drug approvals, they use clinical relapse as their primary outcome, but that is not necessarily an objective measure. And so the FDA had a hard time with it and turned down the first drug, which was Copaxone. Because they did not have any supporting surrogate marker data. Beta seron came along, even though their clinical outcome was positive. The beta seron came along and they did have the supporting evidence on MRI, which is an objective measure. There is a super strong correlation between MRI disease activity on a group level and relapse rates on a group level. So that's what's missing here. So A, they hit their primary outcome clearly in multiple trials, and B, the surrogate measure that pushed it over to approval was something that is super strongly correlated with a clinically meaningful outcome. So I don't see that analogy really taking place here. And that if I hear Sarah, Dr. Henderson and Dr. Kremen correctly, the evidence over the last 20 years actually suggests that decreasing beta amyloid, once cognitive impairment has kicked in, no longer corresponds with improvement or slowing of decline in memory loss. Did I get that right?
Okay, let me go to Matthew, if you wish to make a comment, because I have a feeling that you feel like you're sitting through the AdCom of November 2020, and you've been here before. You've heard these discussions, you've heard the arguments, and I know that, as you mentioned, the Alzheimer's Association is a very sophisticated group and has been tracking the science for years. So I wanted to offer the chance for you to make a comment and observation as you've heard the discussion so far.
So thank you, Steve. I'm not the scientist, so I'm the policy guy. So I can't get too in depth into a lot of the technical stuff on the medical and clinical side. I just keep coming back to the fact that this is a fatal disease where there is no alternative. And right now, something, even a little something, is better than nothing. I look at the, I know this is a clinical question, but when you get to the economic question, if this drug is no benefit, then the economic evaluation would have come out as zero, right? So, because the cost-effective price of a drug would be zero if there was no benefit to it. So there is some benefit to this, and given that there is no other alternative, this is definitely, from our perspective, better than the status quo. I think the debate on the CDR. I mean, this is the FDA has said this is a valid way to measure this, and we're going to accept this in our review. So I just keep coming back to what from the public comment that we heard from Pam and Laura, what what they go through and giving patients the choice of this.
Okay, thank you very much. All right, Say, I think we're going to have one more comment and then we will vote on this question, so we have time to discuss and vote on the other questions. Say, go ahead.
So I want to make sure that I understood kind of Grace and Mel's kind of points, which I feel like Matthew just kind of highlighted what feels to me like a common misperception. Because ICER is presenting a cost effectiveness number, it must mean that the drug is effective, because if there is a cost effectiveness number, it means that they have concluded that it is effective. What I heard from Mel was that we are not actually saying that we agree that this is effective, but if it is effective, then this is the most effective number that we can give. Because I certainly do not, my reading of the evidence, it seems like it is not at all clear that this is effective, but the numbers that, it feels like what Matthew just said is what I worry is going to be a common misinterpretation of the report.
Go ahead. Mel, would you like to respond?
No, I was just going to respond to that as well, is that the uncertainty of our estimate definitely spans from not effective and 0 to closer to being effective. So we have to keep uncertainty in mind through all of this.
Okay.
Let me just add one more thing to that, Steve, which is, Say, I think on the comparative effectiveness side, we concluded the evidence was insufficient. And that's our bottom line on that. We do not think we know whether this drug works or does not work. For cost effectiveness, we pretty much always try to use point estimates to make our best guess in doing cost effectiveness. And in this case, we essentially averaged the negative trial and the positive trial to try to do a cost effectiveness number analysis and put some numbers on this. But our evidence rating is our judgment on the question you're really asking. On our evidence rating was that we thought the evidence was insufficient, that we can't know whether this drug does or doesn't work, and whether there is net benefit or net harm to giving this drug.
Okay, all right. Why don't we go ahead and put the voting slide back up? And I know that CPAC has the ability to now vote. So is the available evidence adequate to demonstrate that the net health benefit of aducanumab plus supportive care is superior to that provided by supportive care alone? A is yes, the evidence is adequate. B, no. And just to triple check, we should have 15 voting members. So I will wait till we have 15. Okay, see the results, please. Okay, 15 no and 0 yes. All right, let's go forward. So that will ground a discussion later, certainly, but for those watching and unfamiliar with ICER's voting procedures, again, given that broad perspective on value, we also ask questions about the context and special kind of ethical values, if you will, and other potential benefits that might be even beyond the health benefits of a treatment. So the first one here, there's a long intro. It basically says, when you're thinking about long-term value for money, what's the relative priority that we should give to any effective treatment for Alzheimer's disease? So here, we're not asking to think about aducanumab, any effective treatment for Alzheimer's disease on the basis of 2 contextual considerations. The first of which is the acuity of need for treatment of individual patients based on the severity of the condition being treated. So again, this is basically the context of Alzheimer's disease, the acuity of the need for treatment of individual patients based on its severity. Would you say that we would give any effective treatment very low priority, average, high, or very high priority? All right. Now, I know, again, everybody has their own perspective on Alzheimer's disease, personal, family, friends, as we've talked about throughout the course of the day. I'd like to invite one of our patient representatives, if you'd like, to say anything more. I know you've had your chance for public comment. Is there anything more you'd like to say to the CTAF panel before they take a vote on that question about the acuity of the need for treatment?
I think I'd ask Laura, who
She has her hand up.
lived through this, to comment on that. Laura.
Sounds good. Laura?
Everyone, thank you. For me, I'm very interested in the trial process. I learned a lot about it many years ago when I was on that panel. And I also love math. So I keep thinking to myself that I remember when I was first in this world, I heard an expert say, if you've seen one patient with Alzheimer's, you've seen one patient with Alzheimer's. And I'm trying to figure out, how can we really make judgments on what this drug may have done to change my daily life with my husband, when I really feel like there wasn't enough people with enough variables represented in the trial. And I think that that's possibly an impossibility. In my work with, I have a support group for about 10 years that my husband started, and I've met a couple of hundred people through this group. And the commonality of the behaviors that are most challenging to deal with is there, but they're really very different from patient to patient. And I just can't get myself comfortable with the fact that I don't believe you've tested enough different people. And the reason I say that is mostly because the trials came out different and the placebo results are different. This tells me you didn't have a big enough selection. And that makes me say, please don't take this away from people just because of that. Because what this would do is it would open up more people to show if there really is a chance with this drug. And I think that the people would need to be very well educated on really what were the side effects, and if in any way we could come up with some sort of an understanding of, is there a common thread between the people who had the worst side effects? Like, for instance, my husband could literally feed himself with a fork until within 2 weeks of his death. There are people who can't walk in the first year. My husband walked until the end, and you know what? And then he was bedridden for over a year. And one day he got up and started walking again. What is the commonality between the people who really suffered with this drug? And how do we know that there isn't some subset of this vast group of people that would benefit greatly? And I'll cut it there because I know everybody can take that to greater length. Thank you for listening.
No, thank you, Laura. Thank you very much. All right. I think we can go ahead then and vote on the first question, which is the relative priority for any effective treatment in the future. Now, thinking about Alzheimer's as a condition, what relative priority do we want to give any effective treatment based on the acuity of need? So we'll wait till we have 15 votes again. Okay. All right, we have 12 very high priority, 2 high priority, 1 average priority. Great, thank you. Let's go to the next question. Again, the same preamble about thinking about any effective treatment. And here, as opposed, if you will, to the acuity based on the severity, what about the magnitude of the lifetime impact on individual patients of the condition being treated? Maybe just a quick comment, perhaps from one of the clinical experts. I know we have some who care for people with Alzheimer's on the panel itself, but either Dr. Kremen or Dr. Henderson, what would you say about the magnitude of the lifetime burden? Over years, how would you frame that for the panel?
Well, I would say that there's great burden over the lifetime because this disease is not over usually in a year. I mean, we're talking about years. And we don't know how long that will be, but it could be 5 years, it could be 10 years, it could be 15 years. So there's great burden.
And I agree.
Any questions or comments before we vote? Jeff?
Thank you. I have a question about the question. Are we thinking about only the burden on the individual, or are we also able to consider the burden on the caregiver?
The caregiver question is actually coming up next. Not next, but like 2 votes from now. So it's coming. So in this case, we're talking about the magnitude of lifetime impact on the individual patient. Okay, let's go ahead and vote on that question then. All right, see the votes. All right. 12 said very high priority and 3 said high priority. Good. All right. Going forward, now we are shifting a little bit from the frame of talking about any effective treatment for Alzheimer's disease to thinking about aducanumab and its potential kind of spillover benefits, if you will, outside the way that we sometimes narrowly define health. Now, health obviously helps us achieve other broader goals in our life. And not all of that can always be kind of well captured in a cost effectiveness model, especially for treatments of chronic illness. So the question here is, what are the relative effects of aducanumab plus supportive care versus supportive care alone on the following outcomes that, again, can inform judgments of overall long-term value for money for this treatment? So here, the first one is on patients' ability to achieve their major life goals related to education, work, or family life. So here again, you are asked to think about your view of the relative effects of aducanumab. And I know it was a unanimous vote that there was not adequate evidence to demonstrate its benefits over best supportive care. So factor that in, but the question here is not any effective treatment, it is aducanumab itself. What do we think about its potential broader, if you will, ability to help patients in this way? Any questions about the question? Okay, anybody want to ask?
Steve, this is Ralph. I have a question because it's written a little differently than it has been in the handout sent to us. So where 1 was major negative effect and 5 was major positive effect. Can you describe how you want us to vote again for this?
I'm sorry, can you put the voting slide back up again? That's the way it should be. Yeah, major negative to major positive. So I'm seeing the same voting scale, Ralph. So I'm sorry, what's the question? It's about, so this is asking, does aducanumab have from major negative to major positive effect on patients' ability to ...
I now see that, but on the voting question that we sent doesn't have it listed that way.
Sorry.
But vote it the way this slide has.
Got it. Okay, 2 other questions. Rena?
Just to clarify, we should also take into account if we choose to side effects for the answer to this question.
Yes, the basic, it's the effectiveness in terms of the overall effects of aducanumab. Its effect on patients' ability to do these things, to achieve these things. Liz, yeah.
Yeah, and does that also include sort of negative impact of kind of financial loss to the family, and so less money for support services and things like that, if they're burdened with the cost?
Yes, I think it's fair to consider that that's part of if we're talking about the broader effects on patients, then I think the broader effects of the treatment are fair to include, yes. Okay, let's go ahead and vote on that question. Again, A is 1. You can see the scale there. Just don't get them mixed up. Okay, we have all the votes. All right, so we have 2 votes for major negative, 7 votes for minor negative, and 6 votes, I believe it is, for no difference. All right, moving forward to the next question. This is the caregiver question. So it's the same. We just didn't want to continue to repeat all of the words. So to get a bigger font, This again is talking about aducanumab specifically, and its spillover effects, again, if you will, on caregivers' ability to meet their quality of life its effects on caregivers' quality of life and or their ability to achieve major life goals related to their education, their work, or their family life. Not any effective treatment, aducanumab specifically. Any questions about this that you'd like to ask of patients or clinical experts or each other?
It's Annetta, just to clarify, here we are also supposed to consider the financial toxicity.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, let's go ahead and vote. Excellent. Okay. Fairly similar to the previous one. We have 3 having a major negative effect on caregivers, 7 having a minor negative effect, and 4 having no difference. All right. Excellent. Okay, we have one last voting question. This one is about aducanumab, just as we've talked about in its broadest sense, thinking about whether aducanumab is likely to have a major negative effect to major positive effect on society's goal of reducing health inequities. And just to make it clear as day, this is a mix of its clinical effectiveness, its harms as part of that, the financial repercussions. Sometimes it has to do with its mechanism of delivery, whether it would be more able to reach people in underserved areas, et cetera. So it kind of includes all of that as we think about the possibility that aducanumab will help society reduce health inequities. Anybody want to, I know we're going to bring this up in the policy roundtable in terms of opportunities to think forward in time. Does anybody have any questions about aducanumab and where we are today in relation to this voting question?
Steve, this takes into account the price
yes.
of the drug. Yes.
Yep. Yes, it does. Catherine, I'm sorry, that was Catherine's question. There you go. Anybody else have a question or a comment? Jeff.
So building on what Dr. Phillips said, not only does it maybe take into account the price, but also whether people have insurance that might cover that price. How are we to think about it? Should we think about what we think is most likely to happen, or should we assume everyone's got insurance or everyone doesn't have insurance? Or
the way that we have asked you to vote on these in the past is to consider the world, well, I wouldn't say best case scenario, but you don't have to think of it as if you could start from scratch and make a healthcare system where everybody is insured with the same insurance. As this would roll out in the American healthcare system, do we think, because there are some interventions, the reason that this is a common voting question, obviously, is because this is an important goal of society, and because there are some interventions that might have special abilities by the way that they are delivered, targeted, et cetera, in a way that would help us reduce health inequities. So it's to capture that potential benefit of effective drugs. So again, here you're factoring in aducanumab and whether you think it is or isn't effective, to what extent, its cost implications, and all of the other aspects of the health insurance and delivery system. Do we think that aducanumab coming in will help us reduce health inequities? To what extent? Major negative or major positive and in between? Okay, great. Any other questions or comments about that? Not seeing any. Let's go ahead and take a vote. All right, so we've got 9 major negative effect, 4 minor negative effect, 1 no difference, and 1 minor positive effect. All right, since we have just a few minutes, we can end early and take a slightly longer break before the policy roundtable. But would anybody like to comment on their votes and things that they would like to tee up for the policy roundtable in relation to some of these votes? This one obviously is one that we will be addressing, but anything in reflecting upon your votes that you'd like to mention at this point? For instance, somebody who voted, oh, sorry. Yes, Sanket.
Thanks, Steve. I just wanted to comment on, very helpful to have these votes and to think about the patient's perspective, the clinical perspective. And I think one thing that led me in terms of concern was around the costs, not just to the healthcare system, but also to individual patients who might be required to go to various tests and have significant co-insurance and other out-of-pocket costs. I think that ended up informing my, in the context of the evidence and in the context of the value assessment, I think thinking about the burden that might fall and perhaps the negative implications to other aspects of care, the sort of standard of care and supportive care, that might be helpful. Just want to comment that I think that potentially is a big burden that could fall, and that led me to concern.
All right, thank you, Sanket. Annette?
Yes, so I had mentioned before that I practice in Kaiser, and we have a lot of middle class and also people on public assistance programs. And so I am very, very concerned about this driving up inequities because so many patients, most of the patients who have inadequate insurance or no insurance are people of color. And so it does make me worry, given the other thing I worry about, of course, I've mentioned this a couple of times, is that we are being asked to believe that the brain hemorrhages and edema that this drug causes are of no clinical significance or of minor, only cause major complications in a few people, but we really haven't been presented with the data. We've only been presented with 1 year worth of data and not accounting for the potential for lag in harm in these patients. So it's very possible that there's no benefit for a year, but 5 years from now, their cognitive decline accelerates in the people who developed ARIA on this treatment. So, I worry, and I think this is teeing it up for the roundtable, that we're talking about reverse Robin Hood again here, where we're talking about taking little bits of money from the average American and through the healthcare system and transferring it to the stockholders of Biogen. And that it's, again, a healthcare system set up to benefit, wealthy white people. So that influenced my voting. Both of those considerations influenced my voting a lot.
Okay, thanks. Ralph.
Hi, Steve. Just a general question related to a bunch of comment related to a bunch of these votes. I remain concerned about the drug safety in patients on anticoagulants, particularly on those with atrial fibrillation or valvular disease. Not only do I have a concern about the increased risk of ARIA and brain hemorrhage with patients on both therapies, but I also worry that patients and clinicians may actually stop anticoagulants to justify taking this unproven drug and then suffer cardioembolic strokes when discontinuing scientifically proven, evidence-based anticoagulant therapy. So that's a significant negative value for me.
All right, thanks. Yeah, we're going to come back to considerations around insurance coverage criteria and what they will do with that kind of issue in coverage criteria. So I'm glad you mentioned it again. All right, we're going to, in about 5 minutes, we've got 4 hands up. So they're going to have to be pretty quick, both on the question and any kind of answer I might have. So I'll be quick too. First up was Catherine.
Well, Alzheimer's is a terrible disease. I mean, there's no doubt about it. My mother died from it. But what I keep returning to, and I hope we can cover in the roundtable, is there are other terrible diseases out there. And we need to think about the big picture. I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thank you. Say.
Just to kind of my explanation. So I think like so many people here, my mother had Alzheimer's and she died 6 years ago. It was incredibly, I kept thinking as a geriatrician, even among doctors, I of all people should be able to handle this. And I frequently felt completely overwhelmed. So I absolutely hear everybody saying we need therapy. We need an effective therapy for this. However, with my clinical researcher hat looking at the data, I feel like if I had to guess, and there's clearly substantial uncertainty, if I had to guess, I think the data is stronger for net harm than it is for net benefit. It's hard for me to believe that 40% of people having brain swelling is something that we can safely ignore. Maybe it is, but I think that is incumbent on the manufacturer to prove that it is, because if I hear 40% brain swelling, I think I just start out with a lot of concern. And that combined with the cost, and I think this is something that I think we absolutely could worsen disparities. I also worry about how it could potentially dramatically improve the quality of life for caregivers and for Alzheimer's patients if we could actually funnel that money for more in-home help. There's so many things we could do with this amount of money. That to spend it on a medication that I feel like it's more likely to be harmed than help, it seems really ill-advised.
All right, thanks. And Joanna.
So I think for me, the economic cost was certainly a driver in this discussion. And I look at the overall access to healthcare, and I worry about the impact of the cost of this particular drug and how that will affect access and distribution of healthcare across the spectrum.
Okay. Thank you very much for those comments. They both help, I think, give context to your votes that you've already taken. And they set us up really well for some of the most important issues that we're going to tackle in the policy roundtable. It's going to start at 4:45 Eastern, 1:45 out there. And just again, to kind of give a quick overview of what's coming, we're going to start talking about patients and doctors and how the conversation is going to start to happen. We're going to talk about disparities and how treatments like this in the future and now will be introduced in ways that hopefully won't accelerate our problems with disparities. We'll talk about price. We'll talk about coverage in private insurance market and at Medicare. And we'll talk about the confirmatory trial and the broader research landscape for emerging treatments. So that's coming up when we start back at 4:45. But I want to thank the CTAF for the votes and for the discussion. We'll welcome some distinguished people to be on our policy roundtable and help us give perspectives on those important issues. So we'll see you back at 4:45 Eastern.